The masked monster stalks his prey.
He might be in the backyard.
The smell of evil oozing from every pore.
He might be behind a bush.
And when darkness fills the night sky, he quenches his insatiable thirst for blood.
And there was a man standing there with a ski mask with a long butcher knife,
taunting his victims, reminding them that their night of terror will last forever.
I'm going to spread your blood all over my body.
And how he's described physically is underwhelming.
Extremely small penis.
Cops say no one was safe from the madman known as the Golden State Killer until now.
Finally, I am seeing the face of this guy that I've only known with a mask on.
You've heard about the dramatic arrest of the alleged serial killer who terrorized California for 42 years.
In a perfectly executed arrest, my detectives arrested James Joseph D'Angelo, 72 years old, living in Citrus Heights.
Now, you're about to learn how investigators found the evidence to build a case against Joseph D'Angelo. Cops suspect him of committing at least 12 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries.
Very quickly, we were tied and gagged and blindfolded.
Jane Carson Sandler is one of the earliest victims. She says after midnight, a masked intruder burst in as her 3-year-old son was sleeping next to her.
And he was just standing right over me. I mean, he put a knife right to my chest and made a few little cuts. We were tied and gagged and blindfolded very quickly. He told me if I were to say anything, he would kill both of us. And he just kept telling me to shut up.
Jane says the attacker lurked inside the house for an hour until he finally left. She claims her assailant made sure she would never forget him.
He'd call and then there would be no one on the other end of the phone. And I just knew it was him.
Mary Beardsley claims she got a similar threatening message on her answering machine back in 1986. She now believes it could have been the Golden State Killer stalking her.
The same, I'm gonna kill you. The same cadence of speech.
How long have you personally been tracking this man?
24 years.
Just before D'Angelo's news-making arrest, Paul Holes retired as an investigator with the Contra Costa County DA's office. He spent virtually his entire career searching for the suspect.
The last 10 years was pretty much, I've been on this case for around the clock.
How many persons of interest did you rule out within this time?
Many. I couldn't even tell you.
Holes says the Golden State Killer left a verbal clue during one attack, a clue he has been pursuing for years.
Literally raping that victim. He is saying, I hate you, Bonnie, over and over again. So we've always thought this guy has a significant Bonnie in his life.
And because the perp wore a mask and left no fingerprints behind, the only physical description to go on was scanty.
They all described him having an extremely small penis.
Sacramento County Sheriff's investigator Carol Daly says that creepy clue could be key to the case.
We followed through on everything that was unusual. So when they started talking about how small his penis was, we went to a doctor to see if there was a condition of kind of an infantile penis, a patients that they might see.
Investigators say as the suspect notched more crimes on his belt, he became more brazen.
At a certain point, he separates the female out into the family room, and he comes in with the dishes and puts it on the male's back and tells the male, if I hear these move, she's dead, or I'm going to cut a part of her off and bring it to you.
Cops say his last known attack was in 1986, but the search to find him never ended.
How much of that did you feel like I'm this close?
There have been many times over the years when I thought I had him. And I'm thinking, I've got him, I just need the DNA results to come back.
Familial DNA would be the key that would unlock the mystery. Paul checked ancestry websites for any similarities to the suspect's DNA from the rape kits.
I needed to see if I could find potential relatives, even distant relatives, to help identify the Golden State Killer.
And what ultimately led you to Joseph James DeAngelo?
So I found a few relatives, and by looking at who they were, we found DeAngelo coming up as a possible person of interest.
But cops still didn't have enough. The first sample was only touch DNA. They had to go back for more. So now a task force of the FBI and the Sacramento Sheriff's Office starts following DeAngelo. It was an undercover operation, but some neighbors sensed something strange was going down. Did either of you notice surveillance, or perhaps there's an undercover officer in the neighborhood? Did you see any of that?
I actually did.
Kevin and Grant, who don't want their last names used, both live on the street behind DeAngelo's house.
I walk my kids, like on my days off, we go on walks in the wagon and around the neighborhood, and we walk past Joe's house a fair amount. And there was just a minivan with the windows all tinted, and I glanced at it and I was like, that's odd. I was like, I don't know why that's there.
I talked to some of his neighbors on the right and left of his house, and they said 6 or 7 days before the arrest, they started noticing undercover vehicles in the neighborhood.
So actually, some of the neighbors caught on to that. Do you think that he did at one point?
With him, it is always possible.
Investigators were desperately trying to get a second form of DNA. They still won't reveal exactly how they got it, but once they did, cops moved in quickly.
We had 2 DNA samples that were obtained at different times. An initial DNA sample that was tested, and it gave us some information that we're on the right track. And then finally a better DNA sample, again discarded in a public location, that conclusively showed DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer. It was sufficient for an arrest warrant to be obtained.
Did he go willingly, or was there a standoff?
Let's just say that he didn't have a choice in the way it was done. When he's taken into custody, you could see that he was stunned that he had been caught.
And investigators soon learned they arrested a former cop. DeAngelo was a police officer in Auburn, California, but was fired after he was accused of shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer.
He was hiding behind his badge. You know, it's very duplicitous in terms of, on one hand, he's sitting there issuing, traffic tickets. On another hand, he's taking that uniform off and going and raping and ultimately killing.
In later years, DeAngelo worked as a mechanic for this truck distribution center in nearby Roseville. And what about that mysterious woman named Bonnie?
We did run across the newspaper article of an engagement to a Bonnie back in 1970. So that caught my attention. And then it's like, well, where's the marriage as a result of that engagement? And we didn't find that marriage. So it looked like it was a relationship that went sideways on him.
Did heartbreak lead to the heartless attacks on dozens? Investigators say suspected Golden State Killer Joseph DeAngelo was hiding in plain sight.
We found the needle in the haystack, and it was right here in Sacramento.
Right here in the modest house with a pristine yard in the Sacramento suburb of Citrus Heights.
How did that feel when finally, after all of these years later, you had your guy?
It was a surreal moment for me. Finally, I am seeing the face of this guy that I've only known with a mask on.
Investigator Paul Holes has spent most of his career trying to catch the elusive masked monster. He says DeAngelo's DNA matches the DNA gathered from decades worth of rape kits, leading him to believe the portly old grandfather is the grisly serial killer.
What did you think of that face that you saw?
Well, when I was looking at him, he had been arrested and placed in the interview room. And I looked at him through the TV monitor, and I saw a defeated man. He realized he had been caught. He did not say anything, nor did he deny anything. He just sat there, and there's numerous attempts to engage with him.
What did you make of that?
He was sitting there biding his time. He was strategizing. He's listening to the questions, trying to figure out what we knew about him. And ultimately, try to enact a strategy that would help himself out.
Now the cul-de-sac where DeAngelo lived is a crime scene. Crime Watch Daily has confirmed he bought the house in 1979 and lived here with his wife and 3 daughters. His youngest was born in 1986, the same year investigators believe he committed his last murder. A swarm of FBI agents, cops, and sheriff's deputies are searching for any additional physical evidence that could bolster the state's case.
When you first saw the home he was living in for all these years, what he thought was hidden and just under the radar, what did you first make of it? Was it immaculate like his backyard?
The outside appearance of the house was very different from the inside, and the inside is what I would call just sort of an organized clutter. So I took that and I said, this guy, he's putting on the facade. The outside that people can see, of course, is this nicely manicured lawn that blends into a nice middle-class neighborhood. But inside, nobody can see it. I'm looking at him moving through that house, sitting down at this desk where he was building a model airplane that ultimately he could fly.
DeAngelo's wife, a divorce attorney, and their 3 daughters were not living at the house when the suspected Golden State Killer was arrested. DeAngelo's house has become a sort of instant tourist attraction. Looky-loos trying to get a glimpse at that place where the alleged Golden State Killer lived. The folks who live in the neighborhood knew him simply as Joe, but one neighbor had a different name for him.
We immediately started calling him Freak because we didn't know what his name was, and he would always be on the driveway kind of freaking out.
That's Natalia. She doesn't want her last name used. She lives across the street from DeAngelo and claims his angry rampages against himself, yes, against himself, were epic.
When he would go on those rampages with screaming at himself, and it was kind of uncomfortable to be around that because we never knew where it was going. So we would go retreat back into our house, and you could still hear him ranting and screaming from inside the house. That's how loud he was.
Natalia tells me in between the freakouts, DeAngelo appeared to be a good father.
He had an adult daughter. He was a typical grandfather with his granddaughter. On Halloween, he used to take his granddaughter trick-or-treating.
So you saw 2 different sides of him, the yelling, what you referred to as the freak moments, and then an endearing grandpa.
That's correct, yeah.
Over DeAngelo's back fence, on the next street over, Grant, who doesn't want his last name used either, describes his neighbor as a paranoid old curmudgeon.
He would yell at us if we got too close to his fence line. He would say that we were spying on him or maybe throwing things onto his property. It wasn't uncommon to hear him yelling at his wife, yelling at his kids, yelling at himself, and that was the scariest. I remember he would have arguments with himself loudly and violently.
When you said violent argument with himself, how so?
Screaming, "I'll kill you," or arguing something about killing somebody. Lots of cussing, lots of cussing.
Grant claims his family had a couple of scary confrontations with DeAngelo.
This one message was a death threat that was left anonymously. The threat said, "If you don't get rid of your dog, I'll deliver a load of death to your family." And my dad immediately recognized that it was Joe's voice on the answer machine tape. Joe came out of his house, said that the dog was being too loud, and that's why he left the message. My mom had an incident with him in 2001 where she was doing yard work in her backyard early on a Sunday morning, and Joe came over from his house, let himself into our side gate and into our backyard, and confronted my mom in the backyard and just started yelling at her, and it terrified her.
Were you or your husband home at the time of the arrest?
I was home. My husband was off on business.
What was his reaction?
I told him, I said, "You know, Freak, they hauled him away." And he was pretty shocked.
Investigators say during his reign of terror, Joseph DeAngelo committed at least 12 murders and raped more than 50 women up and down the state of California. Cops say he also terrified and tortured his victims. Authorities claim CHERI Domingo and her boyfriend Gregory Sanchez were among his most brutal.
My mom and Greg were killed in our home in Goleta, California on July 27th, 1981.
CHERI's daughter Debbie might have been the third victim that night if it wasn't for an act of teenage rebellion that had her spending the night with a friend.
Normally I would have been at the house. A realtor came in on Monday morning and found the bodies and called the police.
CHERI's arms and ankles were bruised, indicating she was hogtied. She and her boyfriend were brutally bludgeoned to death. And for 5 more years, the Golden State Killer continued his fiendish campaign of terror.
He terrorized the state from top to bottom.
Orange County District Attorney Tony Rackauckus says there is a possibility all of DeAngelo's alleged crimes in different jurisdictions could be combined into one trial.
As far as where it's going to be tried and by whom and who's going to be on the trial team, that decision is going to be made in conference with the other DAs who were involved.
And remember the physical description of the killer's shortcomings.
Extremely small penis.
A judge in Sacramento just ordered DeAngelo provide photo evidence of his private parts. His attorneys are fighting it, arguing that violates his Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. And another thing that is sure to come up in the trial. Remember how the masked man yelled out, "I hate you, Bonnie," during his brutal attacks? Cops have now discovered DeAngelo was once actually engaged to a Bonnie.
Did you ever find Bonnie?
I have not spoken with Bonnie.
But you know where she is. Has she come forward? Has she said anything?
That is under active investigation.
We tracked down Bonnie, but her brother told us she was out of the country. He also confirmed she was once engaged to DeAngelo, but broke it off for what he called good reasons. Her brother did not elaborate. Crime Watch Daily also requested an interview with DeAngelo behind bars. We were told he declined. The 72-year-old DeAngelo hasn't yet entered a plea in a trial process that could take years, facing his alleged victims in court, as well as the relentless DNA hunter who searched every corner of the Golden State seeking justice.
And as a dad and just on a human level, man to man, what would you say?
And I can't even necessarily say it on camera because what he did was so horrible. Just to tell him, you know, you are a true monster and you deserve everything that you have coming to you.